Hi guys, welcome back aboard our 44-foot hurricane damaged DIY catamaran project boat. In this video we're going to attempt to turn trash into gold. We have what might be one of the world's nicest push-pull engine controls, but right now it is a bit of a diamond in the rough. We also have a bunch of old through holes we need to figure out what to do with. There's going to be some holes that needs patching, but that'll be good. It's been a while since we've done some fiberglass and epoxy fun. In last week's video, I had this to say about our engine controls. But yeah, this thing is absolutely toast. But something didn't sit quite right with me on the drive home that night, because looking at those engine controls, they looked like they were made entirely out of bronze. Bronze is very expensive, so chances are these engine controls were very expensive, and maybe, if we're lucky, it's a company that's still in business. And if that's the case, then maybe we can get spare parts. I think a good first step would be to get the controls liberated from the little bit of old helm station they're attached to, and also from these delightfully purple cables. There are 4 cables, 2 for each engine, 1 for the throttle and 1 for the transmission. And right off the bat we have our first item for the spare parts list, a cable clip. Besides the fastener being a little bit stuck, getting the first 2 cables off was pretty straightforward. I don't want to lose these little end connections here. The cables are standard, these connectors are not. To remove the last 2 cables, I needed to get the controls out of the little bit of old helm station. With that done, access was super easy. Despite being dusty and having a few drops of epoxy here and there, they seem to work. Let's dig in and see if we find any other damaged parts. After a quick rinse, it turns out our controls are made by a company in Canada called Kobelt. And a new one of these is around $2,000 US. This does look a little bit like a giant 3D puzzle, but it was put together by a human, so if I take it apart, theoretically a human, namely me, should be able to put it back together again. I believe these little switches are so that you can only turn the engine on when it's in neutral, and these ones aren't doing that well, so we'll obviously need 2 new switches. What's so cool about these controls is that all the parts, all of them are bronze. This is a really nice bit of kit. It is by far the nicest engine controls I have ever seen. Despite everything seemingly working, there is definitely a need for some cleaning and a fresh bit of oil and grease. Having never taken apart one of these before, my photo app quickly filled with photos to document the process, so I'll have a fighting chance of putting it back together again. There are some spring pins or roll pins that might also be good to replace. Either way, these need to come out to remove the handles. In a dark corner in the workshop, there is a little sandblasting cabinet that should do a great job of cleaning up the bronze. Ta-da! That looks brand frickin' new. This is going to be well worth the effort. Old and crusty? Still old, but far, far from crusty. To protect any machine surfaces, I used some disposable gloves and a bit of masking tape. After a few hours of being hunched over, I had finished a little over half of the parts. This was a very satisfying process. Of course, all of that work will be 100% waste if I can't figure out how to put the freaking thing back together again. Color me surprised. I haven't oiled or greased anything yet, with good reason, we'll get back to that, but everything seems to be working. Now, much like when you took your bike apart as a kid, there is one random screw left over. Perhaps one day we'll figure out what that does. This thing is a freaking work of art. It is by far the nicest engine controls I have ever seen. We do need a few spare parts though. We need a new pair of these switches. We also need a new, well, just a single one of these cable clips here. The other one is okay. This one is snapped in two. We have a couple of these rings that are snapped, and then most importantly, we need to find a new dome or cover. And also the plating is flaking off on the handles here, but those I should be able to get replated. I'm not expecting the parts to be super expensive because a lot of the stuff I need, like the little switches here, the little roll pins, the circle clips, stuff like that, that's all kind of off-the-shelf stuff. We don't need to go to the manufacturer for these things. The only thing we need from the manufacturer is the dome and a new one of these cable clips. The reason I haven't oiled and greased this guy yet is because if I do want to get the handles here replated, well then I'll have to take everything apart again. I just want to make sure I find a good place to do that. So if you guys, any of you guys are local and you can recommend a place somewhere around Melbourne that is reliable, both in terms of time and price for replating something like these two small handles, then please go ahead and leave a comment down below. If we do a little bit of workshop math, in 6 hours I've just saved us $2,000. That's the retail price of one of these. Not that I would ever spend $2,000 on engine controls, but you know, it's a workshop math. So yeah, we have a little bit of runway for parts and replating. And that brings us to the sponsor of this week's video, LiTime. LiTime sent us these two 100 amp hour 48 volts lithium iron phosphate batteries. These batteries are based on EV grade lithium iron phosphate cells that will provide 4,000 cycles at 100% depth of discharge. That means if you fully charge and discharge these batteries once a day, they'll last over 10 years. LiTime has developed their own custom BMS for these batteries, and that battery management system provides more than 20 safety protocols guarding against stuff like over discharge, under discharge, damage in extreme weather, and much more. Also, thanks to the custom designed BMS, these batteries boast an impressive 2C discharge rate for 120 seconds or 1C continuously. That means they're very well suited for the high loads you see when starting and stopping a golf cart, and also means that they outperform other options for home energy storage. These solid steel casings makes these batteries easy to install and also protects them from shocks, corrosion, and harsh outdoor conditions in a golf cart installation. All day long I've had the two LiTime batteries power all the work I've done here at the boat. That means all the grinding and all the sanding. That is hours and hours of removing fiberglass with an angle grinder. They've also been powering our 15,000 BTU air conditioning unit inside of the boat and everything that's in our tool trailer, including the fridge and lights. As you can see here on the nifty little display, we're still at 60% state of charge. That is thanks to the whopping 5,200 watt-hour capacity. That means I can easily power our future workshop using LiTime batteries. Of course, capacity is only one piece of the puzzle. What about powering high loads, like for instance my 250 amp TIG welder? It's not the prettiest of welds, but we can't really fault the batteries for that. I am thoroughly impressed with the LiTime batteries. They represent excellent value for money with high power output, rugged durability, and low cost. They're equally well suited for an off-the-grid system with high instantaneous loads and a need for massive storage capacity, or in a small electrical vehicle, like for instance a golf cart. The real-time monitoring through this little display is awesome. And the fact that it's done through a single thin cable that's just attached to one of the batteries makes for a very neat installation. The display requires zero configuration. You just plug it in and it works. You can monitor not only state of charge, but also power, voltage and current, as well as the status for the system as a whole. And if we flip to the last page, then you can see information for each of the two batteries. The batteries communicate with each other using CAN. Now that means if you've got multiple of these batteries connected in parallel, like what I have here, then you can turn off the whole system with just one button. That is very convenient. These batteries merge outdoor ruggedness with smart home energy storage. If you need one battery that balances home energy needs and outdoor adventures, well, then this is it. When Ava and I find a little piece of property in North Carolina where we can build our future workshop, I can easily see lead time being the backbone of our off-grid system. So yeah, check out the link in the description for a great deal, and thank you so much to Lead Time for sponsoring this video. The next morning I returned with the latest batch of engine parts. This is all smaller stuff, like these little pivot connections for attaching the cable to the throttle, or this version for the transmission, along with accompanying cotter pins, stuff like that. It's time to assemble some moving parts on the engine, so we better dust off Mr. Torque Wrench. Armed with a buttload of tools, I headed to the workshop. Last night I was reading the service manual and I found the general torque specs as well as the ones for the flywheel bolts. Alas, what good is Mr. Fancy Torque Wrench when he is out of battery? Luckily, I'm pretty well stocked in the tool trailer by now, so I avoided a trip to Harbor Freight. A lot of this last batch of parts is cosmetic stuff, like this little cover for the bell housing. But there were some functional parts, like this little throttle arm doohickey. What I really brought the torque wrench for were the flywheel bolts, and also the bolts that secure the dampener plate. The astute will no doubt have noticed my silly mistake, but look at these new shiny bolts, and ooh, look at the bell housing in place. Pay absolutely no attention to the dampener plate that's not installed. With that classic Captain Dum-Dum mistake out of the way, progress could be resumed. For the sake of paranoia, I also double-checked the torque on the same bolts on the other engine. That Captain Dum-Dum, he sure likes to sneak up on you. We now have two engines that are ready for what we'll call an end-to-end test. I want to hook up our new engine control panels and I want to hook up the battery. Feast your eyes on this. One of our new engine control panels. I want to get this hooked up with our new wiring harness so that I can make sure that the start button works, the stop button works, and also that the RPMs are correct. I brought along this little guy, which I once upon a time, I think this must have been 8 years ago, something like that, back in Denmark, I referred to this guy as a tachometer, which I think is a much better name than its actual name. So we'll stick with tachometer. The reason I want to just wire up the alternator is, of course, just to double check that it starts charging. So yeah, we have a lot of exciting things to check today. Provided everything goes according to plan today, then while the engines are still warm, I want to do an oil change just to make sure we've got nice clean oil in there for our 700-mile trip north. And after that, well, then we should be ready to stuff the engines back into the boat, which is slightly terrifying, but let's get started. Loaded up with all kinds of goodies in my little cart, I was off to the workshop. I found this oil change pump contraption aboard the catamaran, but as with most of the stuff that's come off the boat, I'm far from sure it'll actually work. At the very least, it'll need some new clampy doohickeys. After much fussing around, it turned out it is absolutely worthless, but I really like the form factor and the portability. Anywho, both of the gearboxes were completely bone dry, so I added the whooping 0.3 liters of oil indicated in the spec. To verify that the alternator is charging, we'll need some wire. This 1/0 wire should be more than enough. Ooh, look at this pretty crimp. I connected the positive to the starter and the ground to, well, just somewhere semi-randomly on the engine. For weeks I have been trying to remember to zip tie this hose in place and also to get this little nut in place. Finally, I remembered. Back on track. After having hooked up the battery, I dug out the shorter of the two extension harnesses. The plan is to have the Darling engine be in the starboard hull, and that will need the shorter of the two extension harnesses. I gotta say, seeing the display all lit up got me pretty excited, and I noticed that there were some unused connections on the back, perhaps for a future fun gold plating project? Finally, I was ready to start the engine. Well, right after putting on this piece of shiny reflective tape for Mr. Tachometer. Above 14 volts means the alternator is charging. Check. The RPMs are spot on when comparing the gauge to Mr. Tacho. Check. The gearbox seems to work, switching easily between forward, neutral and back. Check. With the engine reasonably warm, I sucked out the old oil and replaced the filter with the brand name variety even. Nothing is too good for the darlings. For now, I'll leave the oil a little bit low and just top it off once we have the engines back inside the boat. And just like that, we have the first 0.2 hours on the new control panel. Speaking of the control panel, I noticed something funny when I hooked up the control panel to the other engine. A super loud buzzer. I'm assuming that's the oil pressure alarm. Turns out that was missing a connection on the first engine control panel. I tested both of the engine control panels and repeated all of the steps as with the previous engine, including the oil change. It is a joyous day here in the boatyard. We now have two end-to-end tested engines that are ready to go back into the boat. I'm glad I did the little test because now we know that the alternator is working, the engine control panels is working, and yeah, we didn't really find anything that was wrong except for that little thing with the buzzer that come loose, probably in shipping. But yeah, I do believe we have two good engines. I've already arranged with my emotional support diesel mechanic Jeff to hopefully lend me a hand sometime in the next few days to get the engines back aboard the boat, because that is definitely going to be at least a two-person job. Each of the engines weigh just around 300 pounds, so they're not super heavy, but they're not exactly lightweight and nimble either. And we do have a couple of steps to get down into the engine compartments that we need to navigate. So yeah, I think we'll be in for a bit of a fun time. At this point in time, with us having working engines that just need to be installed and also being fairly close to having watertight hulls, I think what's going to end up keeping us in Florida is going to be the steering. As mentioned in a previous video, we've already ordered the new super spiffy Jifa steering system from back in Denmark. But it's going to be another 8 to 10 weeks, I think, before that arrives. Plus, I'll need some time to potentially modify the boat a little bit to make it fit. So in the interest of moving the boat as soon as possible, maybe, perhaps, if we got a little bit aggressive, maybe we can breathe just a tiny bit more life into the old steering system. All we would need it to do is just for us to be able to limp 700 miles. This drawing is our current Lewmar steering system. We've got the wheel up there, there's a gearbox there, that's the autopilot, then we've got the rear gearbox here, and there are the two rudders. The issue with this for limping 700 miles is the fact that the rear gearbox here is seized up. And just to be perfectly clear, I have zero intentions of taking this boat in its current state, and especially with the current steering system, offshore. What we're going to be doing for those 700 miles is going to be 100% ICW, which is just canals and inland waterways type stuff. So it's not going to be dangerous in that sense. As a part of testing the rudders to see if there was any play or anything I needed to fix, I've disconnected them from the rear gearbox. The only thing that's currently connected to the rear gearbox is this bit of torque tube here that goes to absolutely nothing right now. So let's see if we can persuade that gearbox to maybe just come loose a little bit. The access to the gearbox is through this hatch and then through this little tunnel of sorts. It's not really the easiest place to get to, and just as I was crawling in there, I noticed not one, but 2 wasp nests. I have zero desire to be trapped in a cramped tunnel with a bunch of angry wasps. Unfortunately, the only way to spray them was to be in there with them. Genocide thusly completed, I crawled into my little tunnel. After about 20 minutes of yanking on the gearbox, I was able to get it to move the full motion range. Of course, the gearbox is only one part of the steering system. What about the rest? We have the long torque tube that attaches to the rear gearbox with a U-joint at the end. We also have the gearbox where the wheel attaches, also with a U-joint. And then we have the middle gearbox, but we're missing a U-joint. The spline here looks to be about 22 millimeters with 48 teeth. But there is more good news. In a dark corner of the boat I found the wheel, and attaching that to the gearbox, it seemed to move just fine. The middle gearbox seems to be missing about 4 bolts, but those should be easy to replace. Please note that I'm gently grabbing the spline where the autopilot attaches, which we will never need. And would you look at that? We've got movement. Okay, so what would it take for us to be able to cobble together the old steering and get out of here before it gets too hot? Let's take a look at the confuser. We have all of the bits back here. We have this gearbox, we have that universal joint, we have this gearbox and that universal joint. So all we need is this torque tube or whatever you want to call it, and one more universal joint. I've done a little bit of snooping on the internets, and it looks like this is the exact Lewmar product we would need, the universal joint. It's got a product number up here, 892000057. And the Defender is claiming that it's in stock, but it's going to take 2 to 14 days. $242 is a lot for what it is, but in Lewmar prices, I feel like that's a pretty good deal considering that they wanted $8,500 for one gearbox and an autopilot drive unit. But yeah, of course, that universal joint doesn't really do me any good unless I get the torque tube also. Of course, there is the option of just shoving a random bit of tube or rod in there and just welding it onto the universal joint. As long as we have the universal joint to grab onto the other end of the gearbox, that should be fine. I'll do a little bit more research tonight and see if I can find those U-joints somewhere that's not Lewmar, so it's a little bit cheaper. And maybe I can find the splined ends also, so we'll weld onto those instead of welding onto the U-joint itself. And yeah, then maybe with a bit of luck we'll be able to limp off on the old steering system. But yeah, I definitely don't want to take this steering system offshore. This week I've already gotten a little bit of a head start on replacing, or at least removing, all of the old through holes. This box showed up this morning, super quick delivery from those guys, so that was really nice. This should be all of the composite through holes we need to, well, get rid of all the old ones. Whoa! That is quite the assortment. As you can no doubt see, I've sprung for the True Design ones because I've used those in the past and I've been really pleased with them. This time around though, we're gonna go for the recessed through holes below the waterline. So that'll be a fun little challenge. I might get back to those through holes in next week's video, or we might finish up with getting the engines aboard the boat. All just kind of depends on the timing. Either way, that is going to be it for this week's video. I hope to see all of you guys back here aboard the Catamaran next week for yet more glorious DIY fun. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like. See you!